The medieval joust has its origins in the military tactics of heavy cavalry during the High Middle Ages. By the 14th century, many members of the nobility, including kings, had taken up jousting to showcase their own courage, skill and talents, and the sport proved just as dangerous for a king as a knight, and from the 15th century on, jousting became a sport hastilude without direct relevance to warfare. From the 11th to 14th centuries, when medieval jousting was still practiced in connection to the use of the lance in warfare, armor evolved from mail with a solid, heavy helmet, called a great helm, and shield to plate armor. By 1400, knights wore full suits of plate armor, called a harness. In this early period, a joust was still a martial meeting, i.e., a duel in general and not limited to the lance. Combatants would begin riding on one another with the lance, but might continue with shorter range weapons after the distance was closed or after one or both parties had been enhorsed. Tournaments in the high medieval period were much rougher and less gentlemanly affairs than in the late medieval era of chivalry. The rival parties would fight in groups, with the aim of incapacitating their adversaries for the sake of gaining their horses, arms and ransoms. With the development of the courtly ideals of chivalry in the late medieval period, the joust became more regulated. This tendency is also reflected in the pas d'armes in general. It was now considered dishonorable to exploit an opponent's disadvantage, and knights would pay close attention to avoid being in a position of advantage, seeking to gain honor by fighting against the odds. This romanticized, chivalric revival was based in the chivalric romances of the high medieval period, which noblemen tried to reenact in real life, sometimes blurring the lines of reality and fiction. The development of the term knight, chevalier, dates to this period. Before the 12th century, knight was a term for a servant. In the 12th century, it became used of a military follower in particular. Also in the 12th century, a special class of noblemen serving in cavalry developed, known as milites nobles. By the end of the 13th century, chivalry, chivalry, was used not just in the technical sense of cavalry, but for martial virtue in general. It was only after 1300 that knighthood, knighthood, originally a term for boyhood, youth, came to be used as a junior rank of nobility. By the later 14th century, the term became romanticized for the ideal of the young nobleman seeking to prove himself in honorable exploits, the knight errant, which among other things encompassed the pas d'armes, including the joust. By the 15th century, knightly virtues were sought by the noble classes even of ranks much senior than knight. The iconic association of the knight stock character with the joust is thus historical, but develops only at the end of the Middle Ages. The lists, or list field, was the arena where a jousting event was held. More precisely, it was the roped-off enclosure where tournament fighting took place. In the late medieval period, castles and palaces were augmented by purpose-built tiltyards as a venue for jousting tournaments. Training for such activities included the use of special equipment, of which the best known was the quintain. The Chronicles of Froissart, written during the 1390s, and covering the period of 1327 to 1400, contain many details concerning jousting in this era. The combat was now expected to be non-lethal, and it was not necessary to incapacitate the opponent, who was expected to honorably yield to the dominant fighter. The combat was divided into rounds of 3 encounters with various weapons, of which the joust proper was one. During this time, the joust detached itself from the reality on the battlefield and became a chivalric sport. Knights would seek opportunities to duel opponents from the hostile camp for honor off the battlefield. Froissart describes a tournament at Cambrai in 1385, held on the marriage of the Count d'Ostrevant to the daughter of Duke Philip of Burgundy. The tournament was held in the marketplace of the town, and 40 knights took part. The king jousted with a knight of Hainaut, Sir John d'Estran, for the prize of a clasp of precious stones, taken off from the bosom of the Duchess of Burgundy. It was won by Sir d'Estran, and formally presented by the Admiral of France and Sir Guy de la Trémouille. A knightly duel in this period usually consisted in 3 courses of jousting, and 3 blows and strokes exchanged with battle axes, swords, and daggers. This number tended to be extended towards the end of the century, until the most common number was 5, as in the duel between Sir Thomas Harpendon and Messire Jean des Bars, at Montereau-sur-Yonne in 1387, 5 lances à cheval, 5 coups d'épée, 5 coups de daguette, 5 coups de hache. Later could be as high as 10 or even 12. In the 1387 encounter, The first 4 courses of the joust were run without decisive outcome, but in the 5th Sir Thomas was unhorsed and lost consciousness. He was revived, however, and all the strokes and blows could be duly exchanged, without any further injury. On another instance, a meeting with sharp lances was arranged to take place near Nantes, under the auspices of the Constable of France and the Earl of Buckingham. The first encounter was a combat on foot, with sharp spears, in which one of the cavaliers was slightly wounded. The pair then ran 3 courses with the lance without further mishap. Next Sir John Ambretecourt of Hainaut and Sir Tristram de la Jaille of Poitou advanced from the ranks and jousted 3 courses, without hurt. A duel followed between Edward Beauchamp, son of Sir Robert Beauchamp, and the bastard Clarius de Savoy. Clarius was much the stronger man of the two, and Beauchamp was unhorsed. The bastard then offered to fight another English champion, and an esquire named Genequin Finchley came forward in answer to the call. The combat with swords and lances was very violent, but neither of the parties was hurt. Another encounter took place between John de Chatelmorant and Genequin Clinton, in which the Englishman was unhorsed. Finally Chatelmorant fought with Sir William Farrington, the former receiving a dangerous wound in the thigh, for which the Englishman was greatly blamed, as being an infraction of the rules of the tourney, but an accident was pleaded just as in the case of the 1380 duel between Gawain Machael and Joachim Cater. Jousting is a martial game or hastelude between 2 horse riders wielding lances with blunted tips, often as part of a tournament. The primary aim was to replicate a clash of heavy cavalry, with each participant trying to strike the opponent while riding towards him at high speed, breaking the lance on the opponent's shield or jousting armor if possible, or unhorsing him. The joust became an iconic characteristic of the knight in Romantic medievalism. The participants experience close to 3¼ times their body weight in g-forces when the lances collide with their armor. The term is derived from Old French jouster, ultimately from Latin iextere, to approach, to meet. The word was loaned into Middle English around 1300, when jousting was a very popular sport among the Anglo-Norman knighthood. The synonym tilt, as in tilting at windmills, dates c. 1510. Jousting is based in the military use of the lance by heavy cavalry. It transformed into a specialized sport during the late Middle Ages, and remained popular with the nobility in England and Wales, Germany and other parts of Europe throughout the whole of the 16th century, while in France, it was discontinued after the death of King Henry II in an accident in 1559. In England, jousting was the highlight of the accession day tilts of Elizabeth I and of James VI and I, and also was part of the festivities at the marriage of Charles I from the 10th of July to the 9th of August 1434. The Leonese knight Suero de Quinones and 10 of his companions encamped in a field beside a bridge and challenged each knight who wished to cross it to a joust. This road was used by pilgrims all over Europe on the way to a shrine at Santiago de Compostela, and at this time of the summer, many thousands would cross the bridge. Suero and his men swore to break 300 lances before moving on. The men fought for over a month, and after 166 battles Suero and his men were so injured they could not continue and declared the mission complete. Jousting was discontinued in favor of other equestrian sports in the 17th century, although non-contact forms of equestrian skill at arms disciplines survived. There has been a limited revival of theatrical jousting reenactment since the 1970s. The 2 most common kinds of horses used for jousting were warmblood chargers and larger destriers. Chargers were medium-weight horses bred and trained for agility and stamina. Destriers were heavier, similar to today's Andalusian horse, but not as large as the modern draft horse. During a jousting tournament, the horses were cared for by their grooms in their respective tents. They wore caparisons, a type of ornamental cloth featuring the owner's heraldic signs. Competing horses had their heads protected by a chanfron, an iron shield for protection from otherwise lethal lance hits. Other forms of equipment on the horse included long-necked spurs that enabled the rider to control the horse with extended legs, a saddle with a high back to provide leverage during the charge or when hit, as well as stirrups for the necessary leverage to deliver blows with the lance.